May 14, 1986, 5:43 in the morning. Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury, Connecticut. The morning count was routine. Guard Supervisor Thomas McKenna walked the third-tier catwalk. He moved with the mechanical precision of a man who had performed this ritual 2,000 times. Steam hissed from ancient radiators. Somewhere below, a toilet flushed. The institutional green walls absorbed sound like a sponge, creating a peculiar prison silence. This silence was not quiet, but rather muffled and compressed, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Cell 347 appeared occupied. A body-shaped mound lay beneath grey wool blankets. It was positioned exactly as it had been during the 2 in the morning check. McKenna's flashlight beam swept across the bars and moved on. He noted the cell's occupant as present on his clipboard. Outside, dawn was breaking cold over the Connecticut hills. That thin blue light comes before true morning. Inside, the temperature held at exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It always did. It always would. It would be another 43 minutes before anyone discovered the truth. The body in cell 347 was actually pillows and rolled towels. They were arranged with the precision of someone who had spent months studying guard patrol patterns. By then, the man who should have been sleeping there was already 8 miles away. He moved through pre-dawn darkness in stolen civilian clothes. His prison-issue shoes had been replaced with sneakers taken from the recreation supply closet. He walked with purpose but not haste. He looked like a morning jogger or a shift worker heading home. Nobody worth noticing. In his pocket was $17 stolen over weeks from the commissary. He also carried a fake Social Security card printed in the prison workshop. Finally, he had a slip of paper with one phone number memorized and then destroyed. His name was Christopher John Boyce. He was 27 years old. He had been an altar boy in Palos Verdes, California. There he served communion with scrubbed hands and a pressed white surplice. At 22, he had sold satellite reconnaissance secrets to the Soviet Union for 3 years. Now, he was free. Every federal agent between Boston and Washington was about to learn a crucial lesson. A desperate spy with no way home is the most dangerous kind. What none of them knew yet was that Boyce's escape was not improvised desperation. This truth would not emerge until years later from Russian intelligence archives. His escape was phase 2 of a plan. This plan had begun the moment he entered prison. It required money, specific amounts of it. The money was to be obtained through methods that would make his original espionage look almost quaint. The Soviet intelligence residency, or Rezidentura in Washington, had been waiting for his escape. They had a protocol for this exact scenario. It was detailed in a file marked Retrieval Conditional Asset in Extremis. They had money allocated. They had a route planned through Canada. They just needed him to get there. Christopher Boyce had once photographed top-secret satellite specifications in a black vault in Redondo Beach. He had delivered those photographs to Soviet agents in Mexico City for cocaine money and ideological fury. Now he was about to demonstrate something important. The skills that make a good spy also make an exceptional bank robber. These skills included patience, observation, methodical planning, and absolute commitment. Before it ended, 17 banks would be hit. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would mobilize units across 6 states. The altar boy who had chosen Moscow over America would teach United States counterintelligence a harsh lesson. This lesson was about what happens when you imprison a spy who still believes his handlers are coming for him. The morning count finished at 6:17 in the morning. By then, Boyce was gone. The setup. Christopher John Boyce's journey to cell 347 began not with ideology, but with access. In 1974, at age 21, he was hired by TRW Defense and Space Systems Group. This was a defense contractor in Redondo Beach, California. The group managed some of America's most sensitive satellite programs. His father, a former Federal Bureau of Investigation agent turned McDonnell Douglas security director, had provided the reference. The background check was cursory. It noted an exemplary Catholic upbringing, altar service at St. John Fisher Church, some college, no criminal record, and no apparent red flags. In the paranoid calculus of Cold War security clearance, Christopher Boyce appeared clean. He was assigned to the Black Vault. This was a windowless communications center secured behind cipher locks and reinforced walls. His job was to relay encrypted message traffic between TRW and the Central Intelligence Agency. This traffic concerned Project Rhyolite and Project Argus. These were satellite systems conducting signals intelligence from geosynchronous orbit. These were not weather satellites or communications relays. They were orbital listening posts. They vacuum cleaning Soviet telemetry, missile tests, and military communications. The satellites intercepted everything electromagnetic that Soviet forces transmitted. The intelligence they provided formed the backbone of American understanding of Soviet strategic capabilities during the period of détente. Boyce had access to everything. This included encryption keys, satellite positioning data, and Central Intelligence Agency communication protocols. If this information were compromised, it would not just expose intelligence methods, it would blind American early warning systems. This would happen at the precise historical moment when both superpowers were negotiating the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty II. What the satellites heard determined what American negotiators could demand. It also determined what concessions they could refuse and what Soviet claims they could verify or dispute. The official story, as presented at Boyce's 1977 trial, painted him as a disillusioned idealist turned traitor. Prosecutors described how he had grown disgusted with American intelligence operations. He was particularly concerned with Central Intelligence Agency involvement in destabilizing the Australian Labor government under Gough Whitlam. This was information he had glimpsed in cables passing through the Black Vault. Unable to reconcile his Catholic ideals with what he perceived as American imperialism, Boyce made contact with the Soviet embassy in Mexico City in April 1975. His courier was Andrew Dalton Lee, a childhood friend and small-time drug dealer from Palos Verdes. Lee began carrying Boyce's photographed documents south across the border. He did this in exchange for a cut of the payment. For nearly 3 years, the operation continued. Boyce photographed documents with a Minox camera. It was smuggled into the vault inside a hollowed-out manual. Lee made approximately 20 trips to Mexico City. He met Soviet secret police handlers at the Soviet embassy. He collected payments that ranged from $500 to several $1,000s per delivery. The Soviets were ecstatic. Here was a walk-in volunteer providing keyhole-class satellite intelligence. It was delivered regularly, requiring no blackmail or cultivation. The Soviet secret police designated the operation by the codename Tractor. This name reflected the methodical, agricultural reliability of the supply. It ended stupidly, as these things often do. On January 6, 1977, Lee was arrested outside the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. He had thrown a package over the compound fence during a scheduled meeting that had gone wrong. Mexican police found him carrying documents, contact schedules, and instructions. Within days, Federal Bureau of Investigation Counterintelligence traced Lee's travel patterns. They connected him to Boyce. Both were arrested within the week. At trial, Boyce's defense argued coercion and limited involvement. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Boyce received 40 years. Lee, who had actually carried the documents across international borders, received a life sentence. What the public knew ended there. It was a story of young men, drugs, disillusionment, and betrayal. This spy story was reduced to comprehensible motives and satisfactory punishment. Boyce entered the federal prison system in 1977. He was a Category 3 inmate with excellent behavior marks. His projected release date with good time was 2007. The case was closed. The damage was assessed as extensive but containable. Satellite protocols were changed. New encryption systems were implemented. The system had worked. Justice had been served. What almost nobody understood was that for Christopher Boyce, prison was not the end of the operation. It was an interruption. The Soviets had not abandoned him. They had categorized him, filed him, and planned for contingencies. Boyce, methodical as ever, began observing, learning, and preparing. In later Soviet secret police documents declassified after 1991, a file outlined procedures for extracting imprisoned American assets. This file was labeled Falcon Retrieval Protocol. It applied to those who demonstrated willingness and capability. The requirements were specific. These included proven loyalty, technical knowledge still valuable, and a clean escape without civilian casualties. Critically, it also required sufficient financial resources to reach a designated Canadian safe house outside Montreal. The money requirement was explicit. $20,000 United States dollars minimum was needed. This was to cover transport, documentation, bribes and contingencies during the 6-week journey from Connecticut to Quebec. The Soviet secret police would not risk operatives inside American territory for the extraction itself. This was because it was too dangerous and too exposed. It was too likely to compromise active networks, but if Boyce could reach Canada with funds, they would bring him in. The protocol was clear. The offer was standing. Boyce, reading in his cell, understood what was required. He was a spy who had stolen satellite secrets. He was a technical expert in signals intelligence. He was also a criminal with nothing to lose and a country waiting for him. But first he needed $20,000. In May 1986, he was fresh out of Danbury's minimum security facility. He was free in America with no passport. Every federal agent in New England was looking for him. Christopher Boyce knew exactly how to get the money. He was going to rob banks, 17 of them. He would do it methodically and carefully. He would use the same patient precision he had once used photographing rhyolite encryption protocols. This is what spies do when they have no other option and nothing left to lose. They apply their tradecraft to whatever problem stands between them and survival. If that problem is money, and the solution is 17 federally insured banks across the American Northwest, then that is what the mission requires. The altar boy from Palos Verdes was about to give the Federal Bureau of Investigation a graduate seminar in applied espionage technique. Somewhere in Moscow, a file marked tractor retrieval was waiting. It awaited a signal that its asset had achieved funding and was moving north. The hidden truth. The Black Vault where Boyce worked between 1974 and 1977 was not just a communications relay. It was a node in Project Rhyolite. This was one of the most sensitive signals intelligence operations in American Cold War history. Understanding what Boyce actually compromised requires understanding what Rhyolite was designed to accomplish. Rhyolite satellites were positioned in geosynchronous orbit. This was 22,300 miles above the equator. They maintained fixed positions relative to Earth's rotation. Their massive dish antennas aimed downward at Soviet and Chinese territories. Unlike photoreconnaissance satellites that captured images, Rhyolite intercepted electromagnetic transmissions. These included radio communications, telemetry from missile tests, radar signals, and microwave relays. Every Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile test transmitted telemetry back to ground stations. This allowed engineers to analyze performance. Every military radio network operated on specific frequencies. Every radar installation emitted characteristic signatures. Rhyolite captured all of it, 24 hours a day. It forwarded the intercepted signals to ground stations at Pine Gap, Australia, and Menwith Hill, England. There, National Security Agency analysts sifted the electromagnetic harvest for intelligence. The technical specifications Boyce photographed revealed key details. These included the satellite's orbital positions, listening frequencies, antenna characteristics, and encryption protocols. Most damagingly, Boyce revealed the specific Soviet systems being targeted. With this information, Soviet military planners could determine exactly what America could hear. They knew what frequencies were compromised and what communications were vulnerable. Soviet planners could redesign their telemetry encoding. They could shift radio frequencies and alter broadcast schedules. They could also implement fiber optic landlines for sensitive communications. Effectively, Boyce's espionage allowed the Soviet Union to close the electromagnetic curtain. American intelligence had spent billions of dollars tearing this curtain open. Declassified National Security Agency damage assessments from the late 1970s estimated the impact of Boyce's actions. These assessments were partially released under Freedom of Information Act requests in 2004. They estimated that Boyce's compromise set American signals intelligence capabilities back 5 to 7 years. It also cost approximately $300 million in required system redesigns. One assessment explained the damage. It noted that the subject gave adversary forces a comprehensive understanding of orbital signals intelligence architecture. This enabled countermeasures. These countermeasures degraded collection effectiveness by an estimated 40 to 60% across targeted regions. Recovery required a complete satellite replacement cycle. It also needed a ground station protocol overhaul. However, the damage was not just technical. It was also strategic. During the exact period Boyce was feeding information to Moscow, American and Soviet negotiators were finalizing the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2. They were attempting to codify limits on nuclear delivery systems. American negotiators relied on satellite intelligence to verify Soviet compliance claims. This intelligence helped them understand actual missile capabilities versus publicly stated specifications. It also allowed them to call Soviet bluffs on warhead counts and throw-weight calculations. With the Rhyolite program compromised, that verification confidence eroded. According to Henry Kissinger's later memoirs published in 1999, the Boyce Compromise occurred at a critical moment. He stated that they needed absolute certainty about Soviet strategic forces, and the timing could not have been worse. The public never fully grasped one key fact. Boyce was not some random low-level employee who stumbled onto secrets. He had been specifically selected for the Black Vault position. This was because of his technical aptitude and security background, gained through his father. The system had vetted him and trusted him. It placed him in a position where a single individual's betrayal could compromise billions in infrastructure. The failure was not Boyce's character. Instead, it was the assumption that proper background plus good behavior equaled reliability. The Soviets understood something American counterintelligence was still learning. They knew that true believers who volunteer are more dangerous than coerced agents. Their motivation is internal, unfakeable, and nearly impossible to detect before they act. The Committee for State Security's handling of the Boyce operation demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human intelligence tradecraft. Unlike traditional agent recruitment, which involves blackmail or financial pressure, Boyce approached them. He was a walk-in volunteer requiring no cultivation. The Committee for State Security's Mexico City Residentura, operating under diplomatic cover in the Soviet embassy, assigned the case. They gave it to Viktor Ivanovich Cherkashin, pronounced Viktor Ivanovich Cherkashin. Cherkashin, a counterintelligence officer, later handled agents like Aldrich Ames, pronounced Aldrich Ames, and Robert Hansen, pronounced Robert Hansen. Cherkashin's approach with Boyce was textbook. He accepted the volunteer cautiously and verified authenticity through document analysis. He also established secure communication protocols. Critically, he planned for continuity if the asset was compromised. That contingency planning transformed Boyce's 1977 arrest. It turned the end of his espionage career into merely an interruption. Committee for State Security files released by Russian archives in the 1990s revealed Cherkashin's actions. He immediately initiated a protocol for a frozen asset when news of Boyce's arrest reached Moscow. The file remained active. It contained periodic reviews assessing Boyce's situation, projected release dates, and extraction feasibility. A 1983 assessment noted the subject's continued loyalty. This was evidenced by his refusal to cooperate with American counterintelligence beyond minimal trial testimony. The assessment added that the subject possessed valuable technical knowledge of satellite reconnaissance architecture and Thomson-Ramo-Wooldridge security procedures. It concluded that the subject represented a potential long-term asset if extraction from incarceration could be facilitated. The extraction plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Committee for State Security would not attempt to break Boyce out directly. This was deemed too risky, too visible, and too likely to fail. Instead, they would wait for an opportunity. This could be a transfer to minimum security, parole, or escape. If Boyce could reach Canada independently with sufficient funds for 6 weeks, Committee for State Security operatives in Montreal would help. They would facilitate onward travel to the Soviet Union via diplomatic channels. The file specified the financial requirement as $20,000 minimum. It also provided contact protocols. These included specific public phone booths in Montreal, call times, and authentication phrases. Boyce was imprisoned first at Terminal Island, then Lompoc, and then Danbury. He was likely unaware of these specific protocols. However, he understood the general principle. The Soviets had not recruited him. He had recruited them. Their gratitude, such as it was, would extend to helping a proven asset. This meant helping him escape American custody and defect fully. He just needed to reach them. That required freedom, mobility, and money. The escape itself was almost comically simple. It was a reminder that security depends less on physical barriers than on consistent human observation. Boyce was transferred to Danbury's minimum security unit in 1985 for good behavior. He spent months studying guard routines. The morning count was at 5:45 in the morning, again at noon, at 5 in the afternoon, at midnight, and at 2 in the morning. Each count took approximately 30 minutes to complete. Guards walked established routes. They checked cells visually through bars, rarely entering unless something appeared obviously wrong. Boyce's plan exploited that visual confirmation. He fashioned a dummy using blankets, towels, and a wig. He constructed the wig from hair collected from the prison barbershop over 3 months. Positioned correctly and illuminated only by a flashlight beam through bars, it looked sufficiently human. It could pass a 6-second visual inspection. The actual escape was mundane. He waited until the midnight count finished. Then he dismantled the air vent cover in his cell. He used a screwdriver fashioned from a broken mop handle. He crawled through ductwork to a maintenance corridor. Next, he descended through a service hatch. Finally, he exited through an unsecured loading dock door. The total time from cell to perimeter was 17 minutes. By sunrise, he was 8 miles away. He had changed into civilian clothes stolen from the prison gymnasium. He moved through suburban Connecticut with no identification beyond a fake Social Security card. He had $17, the clothes he wore, and a memorized plan. His first objective was to reach the Pacific Northwest, far from Danbury. Federal search efforts would concentrate there. His second objective was to acquire money. He needed enough to sustain him for months while establishing contact with Soviet handlers. His third objective was to reach Canada. Christopher Boyce understood a crucial point. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would spend the next 19 months learning this lesson. Espionage training applies to any operational environment. You observe patterns, you identify vulnerabilities, you plan meticulously, you execute without hesitation, you adapt when circumstances change. Whether you are photographing satellite documents or robbing banks, the methodology is identical. Boyce, trained by necessity and experience, was very good at this methodology. The bank robbery campaign began in Idaho Falls, Idaho, on August 21, 1986. This was 3 months after his escape. Boyce walked into First Security Bank at 10:15 in the morning. He wore a baseball cap and sunglasses. He approached a teller window and passed a note. The note claimed he had a gun and demanded cash. It also warned against alarms. The teller complied. Boyce walked out with $2,400. He disappeared into morning foot traffic. He was gone before police arrived 4 minutes later. No weapon was displayed. No shots were fired. No one was hurt. The surveillance photos showed a white male of medium build and average height. He wore clothing purchased at any of 10,000 stores. The second robbery followed similar protocols. Boyce targeted small-town banks during mid-morning hours. He used written notes, maintained a calm demeanor, and avoided violence. Boyce understood that violence attracts attention. It escalates response and creates victims who remember details. He employed professional courtesy, treating bank employees as temporarily inconvenienced rather than endangered. This reduced trauma, minimized resistance, and kept police response measured rather than urgent. Between August and October of 1986, Boyce hit 7 banks. These were across Idaho, Montana, and Washington. He accumulated approximately $18,000. Federal Bureau of Investigation investigators initially treated these as unconnected local bank robberies. These were common enough to warrant routine investigation. However, they did not prompt major task force mobilization. The connection to Christopher Boyce was not made until October of 1986. This happened when a bank surveillance photo from Spokane, Washington was routinely compared against federal fugitive databases. This comparison used new computer imaging technology. The technology was being tested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Identification Division. The facial recognition software flagged a 73% probability match with Christopher Boyce's 1977 prison intake photo. That changed everything. A federal bank robbery suspect was unremarkable. However, an escaped Soviet spy robbing banks to fund a defection attempt was a national security emergency. The Federal Bureau of Investigation activated a special task force codenamed Falcon Hunt. This combined fugitive apprehension specialists with counterintelligence officers from the Intelligence Division. Their assessment was chilling. Boyce was not robbing banks for living expenses or drug money. He was fundraising for an extraction. Every dollar brought him closer to Soviet territory. If he reached Moscow, the intelligence damage would be catastrophic. This was not from old Rhyolite secrets. It was from what Boyce had learned about American counterintelligence procedures, prison security, and surveillance detection. This knowledge came from 9 years of incarceration and 3 months of successful evasion. The task force developed a profile. Boyce would continue hitting small banks in rural areas. He would stay mobile and avoid major cities where Federal Bureau of Investigation presence was concentrated. He would remain in the Northwest, targeting locations near Canadian border crossing points. He would strike during mid-morning hours, avoiding lunch rushes and end-of-day activity. He would escalate frequency as his total approached the threshold amount. This was whatever number he needed to attempt a border crossing. They were right about everything except the timeline. Boyce had studied Federal Bureau of Investigation procedures during his trial. He understood investigative timelines. He knew that once the connection between the robberies and his identity became clear, the search would intensify exponentially. So he accelerated his operations. Between November of 1986 and January of 1987, he hit 10 more banks. He pushed into Oregon and Northern California. He varied his appearance with different facial hair configurations, colored contact lenses, and theatrical makeup techniques. He learned these from prison drama program participants. The 8th robbery at a Bank of America branch in Coos Bay, Oregon netted $4,100. The 9th robbery in Medford yielded $3,800. The 10th through 17th robberies produced between $2,000 and $5,500 each. By February of 1987, Christopher Boyce had accumulated approximately $31,000 in cash. He stored this money in a waterproof bag buried in Deschutes National Forest outside Bend, Oregon. There he had established a primitive camp. He used survival skills learned from books stolen from public libraries. He was 3 weeks from attempting a border crossing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was 6 weeks behind his actual location. In Montreal, a committee for state security officer assigned to the Soviet consulate monitored classified American law enforcement communications. He waited for signals intelligence indicating that a specific fugitive was moving north. The fugitive was moving toward designated contact points. The chess game was approaching its endgame. Neither player yet understood that the board was about to be overturned. Something neither espionage training nor law enforcement experience could predict was coming. It was pure chance. This chance was embodied in a part-time sporting goods store security guard. He happened to be working the wrong shift. It was the wrong evening. He was in a drive-in restaurant parking lot in Port Angeles, Washington. It was February 21st, 1987. The time was 7:34 post-meridium. The location was the Hungry Hunter drive-in restaurant in Port Angeles, Washington. The temperature was 38 degrees. A wind blew from the northwest. Rain began to fall in that persistent Pacific Northwest drizzle. It was too light for windshield wipers, but too heavy to ignore. John Stockwell, age 43, worked part-time security at Bob's Sporting Goods. He also worked part-time as a volunteer reserve deputy with the KLAH Loom County Sheriff's Department. He was sitting in his personal vehicle, a 1982 Ford pickup truck. He was eating a cheeseburger and listening to the radio. He half-watched the parking lot through rain-streaked windows. Off-duty law enforcement personnel unconsciously monitor their surroundings in this way. It was a habit, not vigilance. This was the muscle memory of situational awareness. He developed it over 15 years of minor security work. At 7:37 post-meridium, a man emerged from the restaurant. He was carrying a paper bag and walking without urgency. He moved toward a brown 1979 Daity Sun, parked 3 spaces from Stockwell's truck. The man was a white male. He was in his late 20s or early 30s. He wore a green military surplus jacket, jeans, and hiking boots. He had a medium build. He also had dark hair and a mustache. He was utterly unremarkable, except for one detail. That detail tripped some subconscious recognition in Stockwell's brain. It was the way the man moved his head. He scanned the parking lot with deliberate, methodical sweeps. He looked left, center, right, and rear. Then he unlocked the car door. It was surveillance detection behavior. It was counter-surveillance. This specific head movement pattern is recognized by law enforcement officers. It is unnatural for civilians. However, it is automatic for people trained to identify tails, spot watchers, and detect observation. Stockwell had seen it before. He saw it in training videos. He saw it in practical exercises with Drug Enforcement Administration task forces. He could not articulate why it felt wrong. However, 30 years of pattern recognition screamed at him. Something about this man did not fit the environment. He memorized the license plate. It was Washington State, XJK 847. He watched the Day-T Sun exit the parking lot. The car headed west on Route 101. Stockwell finished his burger. He threw the wrapper in a trash can. Then he drove to the sheriff's station 3 blocks away. At 8:05 post-meridium, he filed an informal inquiry request. He asked dispatch to run the plate through the National Crime Information Center database. This was just to satisfy his curiosity. It was bureaucratic due diligence. It was the kind of low-priority check that typically returns information. This information might include unpaid parking tickets or expired registration. The National Crime Information Center report came back at 8:17 post-meridium. It stated that the vehicle was registered to a vehicle pool. It was associated with a be-on-the-lookout federal fugitive. The fugitive was Boyes Christopher John. He was a white male with a date of birth of February 16, 1953. The Federal Bureau of Investigation case number was 145 SF6734. The report said the fugitive was armed and dangerous. Charges included felony escape, multiple bank robberies, and espionage. It concluded by stating to notify the Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent in charge in Seat Uol immediately. Stockwell stared at the teletype printout. He had recognized counter-surveillance behavior in a drive-in parking lot. He had accidentally found one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. This was an escaped Soviet spy. The spy had been robbing banks for 9 months to fund a defection attempt. The probability of this discovery was astronomical. The implications were enormous. By 8:30 post-meridium, an emergency task force briefing was underway. It was held at the FBI Seat Uol field office. By 9:15 post-meridium, 27 federal agents, 16 state police, and 43 local law enforcement personnel were deploying. They went to Port Angeles. Their orders were to locate and apprehend the fugitive. They had to do this without compromising operational security. If Boyes suspected a police presence, he would run. If he reached Canadian territory, his extraction would become a diplomatic incident. The window for clean apprehension was only a few hours, possibly less. Port Angeles is a small city. Its population was 19,000 in 1987. Christopher Boyes had chosen it specifically because small cities offer anonymity through transients. Logging industry workers, seasonal fishermen, and hikers use the town as a staging point for Olympic National Park. Strangers were common enough to be invisible there. Finding one man in a town that size at night with no fixed address required either massive luck or a methodical grid search. The FBI chose a methodical approach. They divided Port Angeles into sectors. Checkpoints were established on all major roads leading to Canada. They began a building-by-building canvass. This started with cheap motels, rooming houses, and campgrounds. The FBI distributed Boyes' photo to every officer. They emphasized no media contact and no public announcements. This was a fugitive apprehension, not a media event. What they did not know was that Christopher Boyes was not in Port Angeles anymore. He had rented a cabin 6 miles outside town. It was accessible via logging roads. The cabin was deliberately isolated from town infrastructure. He had returned to that cabin at 7:53 post-meridium. He ate his drive-in dinner, then he spread a topographic map across the kitchen table. He used it to plot his border crossing route. The plan was elegant. He would cross at a remote point in the North Cascades. He would hike through wilderness terrain. The Border Patrol could not effectively monitor this area. He planned to emerge in British Columbia near Manning Park. From there, he would hitchhike to Vancouver. He would take a bus to Montreal. He would use the contact protocols he had memorized to reach Soviet handlers. His timeline was 4 days hiking. This was followed by 2 days transit. Arrival in Montreal was planned by March 2nd. He had the money, which was $31,000 buried in waterproof bags. He also had the supplies, the route, and the determination. What he did not have was knowledge. A part-time security guard had recognized counter-surveillance behavior in a parking lot. This triggered a federal manhunt. That manhunt was, at that very moment, tightening around the Olympic Peninsula like a closing fist. The next morning, February 22nd, Boys drove into Port Angeles. He intended to purchase final supplies. These included freeze-dried food, waterproof matches, and topographic maps. He parked on Front Street at 9:15 Anti-Meridiem. This was 2 blocks from Swain's General Store. He walked toward the entrance. At 9:17 Anti-Meridiem, a Washington State Patrol cruiser passed on routine patrol. The officer had been briefed 3 hours earlier at shift change with Boy's description. He noticed a man matching the profile. The man had a military jacket, a mustache, and exhibited scanning behavior. The officer called in his observation. Within 90 seconds, 4 unmarked federal vehicles were converging on Front Street. Boys, entering Swain's, sensed something wrong. There were too many cars moving too purposefully. Too many people were trying too hard to look casual. He had spent 3 years delivering classified documents to Soviet handlers in Mexico City. He had evaded Drug Enforcement Administration surveillance. He had also evaded Central Intelligence Agency watchers and Mexican federal police. He knew the feel of being observed. Every instinct screamed that the net had closed. He exited through the store's rear entrance. He moved quickly but did not run. He cut through an alley toward where he had parked the DT at Ayet Sun. Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Thomas R.I. Lee was positioned on a parallel street. He saw Boys emerge. He recognized the gait, the jacket, and the surveillance awareness. O'Reilly keyed his radio. He reported that the suspect had been spotted. The suspect was heading north on Oak Street, approaching his vehicle. Riley requested backup for the intercept. Boys reached the DT Sun. He fumbled with the keys. He got the door open. Riley's vehicle was 30 yards away and closing. 2 more FBI vehicles blocked the street ahead. A Port Angeles police cruiser sealed the rear. Boys had perhaps 4 seconds to decide. He could run on foot, he could attempt a vehicle escape, or he could surrender. He chose option 4, something the FBI had not anticipated. He sat in the driver's seat. He placed both hands on the steering wheel in clear view. Then he waited. O'Reilly approached with his weapon drawn. He ordered Boys out of the vehicle. Boys complied slowly. His hands were raised. He made no sudden movements. He was searched, handcuffed, and placed in Riley's vehicle. Other agents secured the DAT Sun. The time was 9:22 Anti-Meridiem. The entire pursuit from initial sighting to apprehension had lasted 5 minutes. Inside the DAT Sun, agents found a backpack. It contained maps marked with hiking routes. There were coordinate notations in Boys' handwriting. These showed border crossing points. The backpack also held $700 in cash and fake identification documents. A notebook contained coded entries referencing dates and locations. This was later analyzed as a log of his bank robberies and supply caches. The critical evidence, $31,000 buried in the Deschutes National Forest, would not be recovered until later. Boys, advised by attorneys that cooperation might reduce his sentence, revealed its location. This occurred during interrogation 2 days later. The most significant discovery came from forensic analysis of the notebook. Buried in seemingly random numerical entries was a phone number. It was a 514 area code for Montreal. There was also a date, March 3rd, 1987. Federal Bureau of Investigation Counterintelligence traced the number. It led to a payphone outside a convenience store in Montreal's Russian neighborhood. Surveillance of that phone was conducted over the following 3 weeks. It observed a man matching the profile of a Soviet consular official. He made regular checks of the phone booth. He glanced at the receiver. Occasionally, he made brief calls, then left. The implications were conclusive. The Soviets had been waiting for Boys. The extraction protocol was real and operational. He had been within 10 days of reaching it. If John Stockwell had not been eating a cheeseburger in a drive-in parking lot, events would have unfolded differently. If he had not noticed surveillance detection behavior, the outcome would have changed. If he had not run that license plate, Christopher Boys would have crossed into Canada. He would have reached Montreal. He would have disappeared into the Soviet Union. He would have taken with him 9 years of observations. These included American prison security, federal surveillance methods, and counterintelligence procedures. The margin between success and failure was a part-time security guard's parking lot intuition. That is how Cold War espionage actually worked. It did not involve elaborate technical operations and brilliant strategic planning. Instead, it involved random chance, minor observations, and the incalculable impact of one person noticing something slightly wrong. Boyce was transferred to federal custody in Seattle. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed new charges. These included escape, 17 counts of bank robbery, and firearms violations. Combined with his existing sentence, he was looking at life without parole. The altar boy who had chosen Moscow over America had gambled everything. He had sold satellite secrets and robbed banks to reach his handlers. He had gambled on one final operation. And he had lost because someone noticed the way he moved his head in a parking lot. The full scope of Christopher Boyce's escape and bank robbery campaign did not emerge through trial testimony or Federal Bureau of Investigation press releases. It came out slowly and reluctantly. This occurred over a decade of legal proceedings and intelligence damage assessments. Most revealingly, it came from Soviet intelligence files that became accessible after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. Boyce's trial for the escape and bank robberies began in October 1987 in United States District Court, Western District of Washington. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. It included surveillance photos from 17 banks. Fingerprint matches and the recovered money cash also formed part of the evidence. A notebook documenting his activities and forensic evidence further linked him to the crimes. Boyce's defense attorney, Tony Serra, argued for his client. He claimed the escape was driven by inhumane prison conditions. Fear for Boyce's life also played a role. Serra stated the bank robberies were necessary survival crimes. He argued they were not premeditated offences. The jury was not persuaded. On December 14, 1987, Boyce was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced him on February 8, 1988. He added 25 years to Boyce's existing 40-year sentence. The judge stipulated that the sentences would run consecutively, not concurrently. Practically, Christopher Boyce would remain in federal prison until 2047. At that time, he would be 94 years old. The possibility of parole was remote to non-existent. The judge did not know a critical fact. It remained classified until 1996 and could not be revealed in open court. The Central Intelligence Agency and Federal Bureau of Investigation counterintelligence units had conducted a comprehensive damage assessment. This assessment covered Boyce's original espionage. It also analyzed what he would have represented had he successfully defected to the Soviet Union in 1987. The assessment was partially declassified in 2003. This occurred under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act's ancillary provisions for Cold War intelligence. It concluded that Boyce's intelligence value to the Soviet Union in 1987 would have been substantial. This was true despite his decade-old satellite knowledge. Key findings were summarized in a memo from the Central Intelligence Agency Counterintelligence Center. This memo was sent to the Director of Central Intelligence and dated March 1988. It stated the following. The memo noted that Boyce's direct knowledge of Rhyolite or Argus satellite systems was degraded by time. System upgrades also reduced its value. However, his extended incarceration provided insights into federal prison security protocols. He also observed inmate debriefing procedures and counterintelligence interview techniques. Boyce's successful evasion for 19 months demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Federal Bureau of Investigation fugitive pursuit methodologies. His bank robbery campaign showed operational planning consistent with intelligence tradecraft training. The combined intelligence value of his prison security knowledge, evasion techniques, and demonstrated operational capability would have significantly enhanced Soviet understanding of United States counterintelligence vulnerabilities. The assessment concluded that his defection would have constituted a Category 2 intelligence compromise. Category 2 meant serious but not catastrophic. It was worse than a low-level document leak. It was not as devastating as an active mole inside the Central Intelligence Agency or National Security Agency. However, it was serious enough for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Falcon Hunt Task Force to remain active until Boyce's capture. After sentencing, Boyce was transferred to United States Penitentiary Marion. This was America's highest security federal prison at the time. He was placed in H Unit, which was essentially solitary confinement with minimal human contact. The Soviet side of the story emerged piecemeal after 1991, When Russian President Boris Yeltsin opened Selected Committee for State Security archives in the mid-1990s, researchers made a discovery. They found files related to an operation named Tractor. This included the Falcon Retrieval Protocol, which had been activated upon Boyce's 1986 escape. The protocol confirmed what Federal Bureau of Investigation Counterintelligence had suspected. The KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence, had maintained Boyce's file. He remained an active asset despite his incarceration. They reviewed his status annually. A 1984 assessment noted that Asset Falcon demonstrated unwavering commitment to the Soviet cause. His primary value now consisted of signals intelligence technical knowledge and potential propaganda. The assessment recommended maintaining the asset file active, pending an opportunity for extraction. The extraction plan was detailed and realistic. Once Boyce reached Montreal with sufficient funds, he would call a designated number. This call would be from a specific payphone at a specific time. That time was 8 post-meridian on the first Tuesday after his arrival. A KGB officer from the Montreal Residentiura would answer. The officer would authenticate the call using a verbal passphrase. The phrase was a question asking if it was the sporting goods store. The officer would then provide instructions for a meet location. Boyce would be transported to the Soviet consulate. He would be provided false Canadian documentation. Finally, he would be put on an Aeroflot flight to Moscow via Shannon, Ireland. This was a common routing that avoided United States airspace. In Moscow, he would have been debriefed extensively. He would have been featured in propaganda broadcasts highlighting American intelligence failures. Eventually, he would have been given work as a technical consultant on American satellite reconnaissance systems. The KGB had done this before. They did it with defectors like Edward Lee Howard, who escaped Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance in 1985. Philip Agee, a Central Intelligence Agency officer, also defected in the 1970s. Boyce would have been valuable, useful, and thoroughly controlled. But the payphone in Montreal remained silent. The KGB officer assigned to monitor it was identified in files only as Vasily K. He made his scheduled checks through March 1987. He then received orders to discontinue surveillance. This happened after Boyce's capture was confirmed through intercepted Federal Bureau of Investigation communications. The file was closed on March 28, 1987. A final notation stated that the asset was compromised during the extraction attempt. Operational security failure was attributed to random law enforcement contact. No breach of Residentiura procedures was identified. The phrase random law enforcement contact understated the reality. The KGB's sophisticated extraction protocol had been developed over years. It had been tested successfully with other defectors. However, it was undone by a security guard eating a cheeseburger. The guard happened to notice something slightly off about a stranger's behavior in a parking lot. Decades of tradecraft and millions in operational infrastructure had been established. A willing asset was also in position. All of this was negated by contingency and observation. Perhaps the most significant revelation came not from official documents. Instead, it emerged from interviews conducted much later. In 2002, journalist Lindsay Gruson interviewed John Stockwell, the security guard. This interview was for an oral history project on Cold War domestic counterintelligence. Stockwell, then 60 years old, described what he had seen that night. Stockwell explained that he could not tell exactly what was wrong. The man just moved incorrectly. He seemed too aware. Normal people leaving a restaurant think about their food or their day. This man, however, came out scanning his surroundings. Stockwell thought the man was police, military, or something similar. So he ran the license plate. Stockwell added that after enough years, one develops a feel for when something is off. He believed he got lucky or the man got unlucky. It depended on one's perspective. Gruson then asked if Stockwell understood the implications of what he had prevented. Stockwell responded. Stockwell reported that Federal Bureau of Investigation agents told him later that if Boyce had made it to Canada, to the Russians, it would have been bad. This would have meant an intelligence compromise and a propaganda coup. However, Stockwell did not think about it that way. He focused on what Boyce did. Boyce sold out his country, robbed 17 banks, and spent 9 months running. Stockwell also considered what Boyce did not do. Boyce did not hurt anybody. In all those robberies, no shots were fired and no one was injured. Stockwell believed he caught a spy who was also a bank robber who chose not to be violent. History, he observed, is often funny in this way. The bad guys are not always evil. Sometimes they are just wrong. Christopher Boyce remained in federal custody for 15 more years after his sentencing. In 2002, he became eligible for parole under revised federal guidelines. He had served 25 years total between his original conviction and his escape sentence. His attorney petitioned for release. The attorney argued that Boyce, now 50 years old, represented no further threat. Boyce had also demonstrated excellent behavior during incarceration. His attorney believed he deserved consideration for the non-violent nature of his crimes. The United States Parole Commission was skeptical. However, several factors aligned in Boyce's favor. Cold War intelligence concerns had evaporated with the Soviet Union's dissolution. This made his satellite knowledge historically irrelevant. His bank robberies, while serious, had injured no one. Perhaps most importantly, Andrew Dalton Lee, his original co-conspirator, had been paroled. Lee had received life in prison in 1977 and was paroled in 1998. This made Boyce's continued incarceration appear disproportionate. On March 15, 2003, Christopher Boyce was released on parole. He went to a halfway house in Oregon. He was 50 years old. He had spent 25 years, 7 months, and 12 days in federal custody. Most of this time was in solitary confinement at Marion. Prisoners there spent 23 hours a day in 8 by 10-foot cells. He emerged into a transformed world. The Soviet Union was gone, and the Cold War was history. Satellite reconnaissance was now commercial technology. The secrets he had sold for $77,000 in 1970s currency were available on Google Earth. His parole conditions were strict. He had no contact with foreign governments. He could give no public speeches without approval. He also had no employment involving classified information. Regular polygraph examinations were required. He worked construction jobs, married, and settled in Central Oregon. He gave occasional interviews, always expressing regret for his actions, but never fully explaining his motivations in ways that satisfied questioners. In a 2008 interview with 60 Minutes, correspondent Steve Croft asked Boyce a question. He asked if Boyce had truly believed in Soviet communism. Alternatively, he asked if it had been about money. Boyce's response was telling. Boyce stated that he believed the Soviets represented something different from what he saw America becoming. He admitted he was wrong. They were worse. However, he explained that when one is 22 and angry and has access to secrets, one makes decisions that cannot be unmade. He spent 25 years paying for decisions made in 3 years. He questioned if it was worth it, answering no. He then asked if he would do it differently, answering yes. He acknowledged that he could not take it back. That, he concluded, is what consequences mean. You live with them. One career ended that day in Port Angeles in 1987. Christopher Boyce's career was definitively terminated when handcuffs closed around his wrists on a rainy street. But another career was made. John Stockwell received commendations from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the United States Attorney's Office, and the Washington State Patrol. He continued working security in Port Angeles until his retirement in 2004. He occasionally told the story of the night he caught a Soviet spy in a drive-in parking lot. In Moscow, archives remain partially classified to this day. Within them sits a file marked "Tractor Retrieval Failed." It stands as a monument to an operation that almost succeeded. It also commemorates the asset who almost made it home. This file highlights the random chance encounter that prevented one of the Cold War's stranger epilogues. That epilogue was an escaped American spy defecting to the Soviet Union by robbing banks for travel money. Lasting impact. The Christopher Boyce case transformed American counterintelligence practices. The changes were both obvious and subtle. They created procedural shifts that persist in modified form through present-day intelligence security. The most immediate change came in TRW's Black Vault security protocols. Within 6 months of Boyce's 1977 conviction, the entire Black Vault system was redesigned. The principle of single-person access to comprehensive satellite data was eliminated. New protocols required 2-person integrity zones for all sensitive communications. Biometric authentication was now required for document access. Real-time digital logging of every document viewed, copied, or transmitted was also implemented. No single individual would ever again have Christopher Boyce's level of solitary access to strategic intelligence. The deeper impact concerned personnel security vetting. Christopher Boyce had passed every background check and exhibited no obvious red flags. He came from an impeccable background and demonstrated no financial stress or personal problems before his betrayal. By every metric available in 1974, Boyce was the ideal security clearance candidate. His treason revealed that background checks measuring past behavior could not predict future ideological radicalization. The Insider Threat Detection Program was formalized across the intelligence community in the 1980s and expanded after September 11th. The program shifted its focus from vetting candidates before hiring to monitoring cleared personnel during employment. Behavioral indicators such as sudden foreign travel, unexplained affluence, access pattern anomalies, and expressed dissatisfaction with policy became triggers for additional scrutiny. Although controversial and privacy invasive, the program addressed the central lesson of the Boyce case. This lesson stated that trust must be verified continuously, not granted permanently. The bank robbery campaign's impact on Federal Bureau of Investigation fugitive pursuit was equally significant. Christopher Boyce had evaded capture for 19 months, despite being a highly publicized federal fugitive. This demonstrated that methodical discipline and surveillance awareness could defeat traditional manhunt techniques. In response, the Federal Bureau of Investigation developed the Violent Crime and Major Offenders section. This section integrated behavioral analysis, geographic profiling, and predictive modeling to anticipate fugitive behavior rather than simply reacting to sightings. Christopher Boyce's case provided the template. He stayed mobile and avoided patterns. Boyce used cash exclusively and eschewed contact with family and former associates. He targeted low-priority crimes such as bank robberies. These generated less intensive investigation than his escape alone would have. Future fugitive pursuit protocols accounted for these techniques. They treated intelligent fugitives as adversaries applying operational tradecraft. They did not see them as criminals acting impulsively. The geopolitical impact was subtler but equally lasting. The Rye-O-Light compromise occurred during détente's fragile peak. At this time, both superpowers were attempting to codify arms control through negotiation rather than escalation. The revelation that Soviet strategic forces had been operating with full knowledge of American satellite surveillance capabilities for 3 years undermined confidence. This affected verification regimes underpinning Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2 and subsequent treaties. Henry Kissinger reflected on the Boyce affair in his 1999 memoir, Years of Renewal. He stated that espionage could compromise not merely tactical intelligence, but also strategic negotiations. If Soviet compliance could not be verified independently, treaties became paper promises, enforced only by mutual vulnerability. The compromise shifted focus toward intrusive on-site inspection regimes. This ultimately contributed to the monitoring protocols that defined post-Cold War arms control. That shift from satellite verification to on-site inspection became central to later treaties. These included Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 1, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the Iran nuclear deal. Christopher Boyce's treason had proved that even the most sophisticated technical collection could be compromised by human intelligence failures. This drove arms control toward physical verification. Such verification could not be defeated by a single spy. The human cost was harder to quantify, but no less real. Andrew Dalton Lee, Christopher Boyce's courier, served 21 years before his parole in 1998. He emerged into a world where his name was synonymous with betrayal, and his employment prospects were devastated by his criminal record. He worked construction and wrote an unpublished memoir. He died of natural causes in 2021, largely forgotten beyond a footnote in espionage histories. TRW Defense and Space Systems Group never fully recovered its reputation. Despite implementing comprehensive security overhauls, the company's association with the worst technical intelligence compromise of the 1970s eroded customer confidence. The Black Vault facility was decommissioned in 1981. Its functions were distributed across multiple locations with enhanced security. TRW itself was acquired by Northrop Grumman in 2002, the name disappearing from defense contracting entirely. John Stockwell, the security guard whose parking lot observation ended Christopher Boyce's freedom, received public commendations. However, he struggled with the attention. In a 2015 interview with Oregon Public Broadcasting shortly before his death from cancer, Stockwell reflected on the situation. He felt people wanted to make his actions into something heroic. However, he insisted it was not heroic but simply random. Stockwell stated he merely noticed something amiss, ran a license plate, and got lucky. He explained that if he had finished his burger 2 minutes earlier, he would have missed Boyce. The entire situation, including Boyce's escape and the robberies, ended due to timing and coincidence. Stockwell noted that this bothered him about spy stories, which often make everything seem planned and inevitable. He believed the real story involved chaos, chance, and random intersections, and he just happened to be one such intersection. The most lasting impact may be philosophical rather than procedural. The Christopher Boyce case demonstrated that ideological commitment and authentic belief in a competing system could motivate espionage as powerfully as blackmail or financial pressure. The Soviet KGB understood this, cultivating volunteer agents who approached them rather than recruits they had coerced. American counterintelligence, historically focused on identifying compromised individuals, struggled to detect true believers. These individuals volunteered for ideological reasons rather than being blackmailed or bribed. This lesson, learned painfully through Christopher Boyce, became critical during the 1980s. At this time, a wave of volunteer spies such as Aldrich Ames, Robert Hanssen, and John Walker devastated American intelligence. Each was a volunteer motivated by complex mixtures of money, ego, and ideology. Each passed background checks and security vetting. Furthermore, each demonstrated that the insider threat was not an anomaly, but a persistent vulnerability requiring constant vigilance. Christopher Boyce himself remains the most enigmatic element. He was released in 2003. He has lived quietly in Oregon for 2 decades, working construction and manual labor. He has also avoided publicity. He occasionally gave interviews that revealed more questions than answers. In a 2012 conversation with journalist Kate Boyes for The Atlantic, Christopher Boyce offered his clearest reflection on the choices that defined his life. He stated he was 22 and arrogant, convinced he understood things older, wiser people did not. Boyce believed he was fighting American imperialism. However, he realized he was actually committing treason. He helped a totalitarian state understand American intelligence capabilities. Boyce acknowledged that the Soviet Union used him. The information he provided helped them evade surveillance and oppress their own people. He did not liberate anyone or stop any wars. He just betrayed his country for money and self-righteousness disguised as principle. This information also allowed them to threaten the world. Boyce noted that people thought his escape and robberies were acts of desperation. He disagreed, stating that they represented loyalty to a decision he had already made. He had chosen the Soviets in 1975. In 1986, he was trying to follow through and defect completely, to live with the consequences of that choice. He failed, spending 25 years in prison instead. The ironic thing, he reflected, was that by the time he got out in 2003, the Soviet Union was gone. The country he had betrayed America for did not exist anymore. He had committed treason for a ghost. This thought sometimes kept him awake. When asked if he had been motivated more by ideology or money, Christopher Boyce's answer was unexpected. He admitted he did not know anymore, saying perhaps neither or both. At 22, he believed it was ideology. At 50, looking back, he thought it was ego. He had access to secrets which made him feel powerful and important. Selling those secrets made him feel like he was doing something that mattered. The money, he stated, was secondary. The ideology was justification. His real motivation was that he wanted to be someone who did extraordinary things. He succeeded but learned that extraordinary is not the same as good, a lesson he learned at the cost of half his life. Cinematic Epilogue. A photograph hangs in the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Seattle field office, outside the counterintelligence section. It is not prominently displayed, but it is not hidden either. The image shows a brown 1979 Datsun parked on a rainy street in Port Angeles, Washington. Federal vehicles surround the car, their lights painting the wet pavement in red and blue. The timestamp reads 9/22/35 on February the 22nd, 1987. In the driver's seat, visible through the windshield, a figure sits with both hands on the steering wheel, waiting. One cannot see his face clearly in the photograph. Rain and distance blur the details. However, one can see the posture. It is upright and controlled, not fighting or fleeing, just waiting for the inevitable conclusion of a gamble that failed. Current Federal Bureau of Investigation agents walk past this photograph dozens of times daily. Most agents do not notice it. Some pause to read the small brass plaque below. The plaque states, Christopher Boyce, February 22, 1987. It explains that fugitive apprehension concluded Operation Falcon Hunt, and Boyce was captured by pure chance after a 19-month interstate pursuit. Pure chance. Those two words carry the weight of everything intelligence work fears and cannot eliminate. This includes the uncontrollable variable, the random intersection, and the security guard in the wrong parking lot at the right moment. All the tradecraft in the world, including surveillance detection routes and counterintelligence training, was undone. Even methodical planning was undone by someone who noticed something slightly off about how a stranger moved his head. In Central Oregon, Christopher Boyce drives past banks sometimes. These are ordinary branches in ordinary towns. He wonders which ones he robbed in 1986. The memories have blurred. They were not personal, just targets, objectives, and necessary steps in an operational plan. He does not feel pride or shame about them specifically. He just feels a kind of distant recognition. These memories represent a version of himself that seems increasingly alien. This was the young man who believed robbing 17 banks to reach Soviet handlers was reasonable. He also thought it was achievable and justified. He never talks about what he would have done in Moscow if he had made it. He wonders whether he would have been useful to the Soviet KGB. He also wonders if he would have regretted defection. He might have spent decades in a Soviet apartment watching the country collapse. He would have wondered if he had backed the wrong horse in history's longest race. In Montreal, the payphone outside the convenience store where a Soviet KGB officer waited for Christopher Boyce's call in March 1987 is gone. It has been replaced by a mobile phone store. The Soviet consulate that would have processed his defection is now the Russian Federation's diplomatic mission. It is staffed by people who were children when the Soviet KGB executed Operation Traitors. The whole infrastructure of Cold War espionage, including the protocols, the handlers, and the extraction routes, exists only in archived files and aging memories. Somewhere in Moscow's archives, a file marked Tractor Retrieval Failed sits. It is accessible only to researchers with appropriate clearances and patience for bureaucracy. Inside, there are surveillance photos of Christopher Boyce from the 1970s. The file also contains technical assessments of the intelligence he provided. Financial records of payments made in Mexico City are also present. The file also includes the extraction protocol. This protocol outlined how to bring him home if he could escape American custody. He would also need to reach Canadian territory with sufficient funds. The Soviet intelligence had planned for his full recovery. The file contains one final document. This is a closure report dated March 28, 1987. It concluded that Asset Falcon had been compromised during an extraction attempt due to random law enforcement contact. It also stated that no breach of operational security had occurred on the Soviet side. The report declared that the asset should be considered permanently lost. Permanently lost. A bureaucratic phrase meant that Christopher Boyce would never reach Moscow. He would never complete his defection. He would never fulfill the commitment he made in 1975. This commitment began when he first walked into the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, carrying photographed satellite secrets. He had tried. He had escaped prison, robbed 17 banks, accumulated the required funds, and planned his route north. He had done everything right. And then a security guard noticed something off in a parking lot. That is the photograph the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not display, but should. It is not the brown Datsun surrounded by federal vehicles. Instead, it is the image of John Stockwell eating a cheeseburger in his Ford pickup. He was half watching a stranger emerge from a restaurant. He noticed an anomaly so slight that it could not be articulated. Yet it was too significant to ignore. Cold War espionage actually happened in these random moments. It was not in high-level strategic decisions or sophisticated satellite systems. Instead, it happened when someone paid attention to something that felt wrong. Christopher Boyce sold America's secrets for money and ideology. He escaped from prison and robbed banks to reach his handlers. He came within days of defecting to the Soviet Union. However, he could not defeat coincidence. He could not outmaneuver chance. He could not plan for the possibility that someone would notice his scanning of a parking lot. That person would then care enough to run a license plate. The altar boy from Pash Los Verdes chose Moscow over America. He spent 25 years in prison for that choice. He lives now with the consequences. He works construction in Oregon. He is a free man in a country he once betrayed. He serves a life sentence of a different kind. He knows he sacrificed everything for a cause that collapsed while he sat in a concrete cell. The country he tried to reach no longer exists. All of it, the espionage, the escape, the robberies, and the failed defection, amounted to nothing but pain and loss. Those years cannot be recovered. There is no redemption in this story. There is no vindication. There is no satisfying conclusion. There is just a photograph of a brown date sun on a rainy street. A brass plaque next to it describes the situation as pure chance. Those two words contain the only truth that matters in the end. Despite all our planning, all our intelligence, and all our certainty about control and outcome, history turns on moments too small to predict. These moments are also too random to prevent. The altar boy became a spy. He then became a fugitive. He became a prisoner. Finally, he became an old man with nothing to show for his choices. He had only scars, regrets, and the knowledge that he almost made it. Almost. This is the cruelest word in the espionage lexicon. Christopher Boyes lived it. The photograph proves it. Somewhere in Moscow, a file described as permanently lost confirms it. The truth did not come out gradually or dramatically. It was just there, waiting in the archives, patient as stone. This is the story of a young man who betrayed his country. He escaped from prison. He robbed 17 banks to reach his handlers. He failed because a part-time security guard noticed something slightly wrong in a parking lot on a rainy February evening. That is how Cold War espionage really worked. It did not work with grand strategies or brilliant operations. Instead, it worked with chance encounters and minor observations. It also relied on the incalculable impact of attention paid at precisely the right moment. The rest is just paperwork. This includes arrest records, trial transcripts, damage assessments, and archived files. These files gather dust in buildings that most people will never enter. There is a photograph of a brown dat sun on a rainy street. The timestamp reads 9/22/35. It is dated February the 22, 1987. This was the moment when everything ended. Nothing began except the long, slow aftermath of choices that could not be unmade. Pure chance. Those are the words that hang in a hallway in Seattle. They remind everyone who passes that the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world can still be defeated by one determined spy. Even the most determined spy can be defeated by someone eating a cheeseburger. This person notices something amiss and decides to run a license plate. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The secrets Christopher Boyes sold are declassified history. However, the photograph remains. It is a monument to the randomness that governs outcomes despite our illusions of control. He almost made it. That is all anyone needs to know. That word, almost, contained the difference. It was the difference between a footnote in espionage history and a defector living in Moscow. It separated prison and freedom. It stood between failure and success. Success was measured in inches, minutes, and the peripheral vision of a security guard. This guard happened to be watching when it mattered. The altar boy chose Moscow. Moscow was waiting. Between them, in a parking lot in Port Angeles, stood John Stockwell. He was eating a cheeseburger, unknowing and observant. He was the human variable that no operational plan can account for. No amount of tradecraft could defeat this variable. That is where the story ends. It is not with revelation, justice, or meaning. Instead, it ends with random intersection and ironic outcome. It ends with a photograph that proves nothing. This photograph shows that history happens whether we are prepared for it or not. The brown dat sun sits on that rainy street forever. It is captured in photographic amber. It is a monument to the spy who almost escaped. It also commemorates the guard who noticed something wrong. Everything else is commentary. The photograph is truth. It hangs in a hallway in Seattle. It waits for someone to stop and read the brass plaque. It waits for someone to understand what those two words really mean. Pure chance. That is the only guarantee intelligence work offers. Everything else is just hope, planning, and the desperate prayer that random intersection favors your side instead of theirs. Christopher boys learned that lesson in a parking lot in 1987. The Bureau learned it too. The photograph remains. It teaches this lesson to everyone who passes. It is patient as stone. It is permanent as consequence. It is true as the rain that fell that February morning. That was when everything ended, and nothing could ever be undone.